Okay, well, welcome again, everyone, to a Design and Discourse. Today we have some really great presentations by Bekah and Carissa. Both of them are talking about holistic and holy, different responses to space and philosophies of how people express themselves architecturally. So first we will begin with Bekah, and I will turn the floor over.
Hello, everyone. Just one second while I grab my presentation. How do I make this full screen?
Um, I
Oh,
can't
I know.
see.
I can just
Oh,
do
there you
this.
go.
There we go. Duh. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. So the title of my project is Reconnect, and it's Holistic Design in the Age of Fragmentation. And the thesis for my project kind of frames around the premise that to reframe the built environment and foster genuinely people-centric designs, the acceptance of a holistic perspective in architecture and design through reincorporating classical ideals is imperative. And so with that, my key project objectives are to address the challenges posed by fragmented design approaches, to define classical ideals that must be incorporated so that we can utilize the holistic design remedy, and then to develop a conceptual design project that embodies these principles and that reflects the necessity of beauty, harmony, and proportion. And so my project started out researching a lot of the behind the scenes type things. So the key research topics I had are historical and philosophical context, the impacts of fragmentation, and then the application of holistic design. So getting into the project context, my project actually started just with a simple question, just through my own experiences, especially from traveling abroad here in Budapest. I just discovered there are a lot of differences in the way that we build buildings now and architecture, and I just kind of wondered what changed, what happened. Just the way that in the past everything was very detailed and ornate, and it just took a lot of time to create these structures, and now to very simplified forms, and just kind of the disconnect I even experienced myself between the fact that we have such advanced technology and yet our buildings seem to just be simpler than ever before. And so to kind of dive into that, I started by researching just design philosophy and architecture through history, how it's changed through the times. And just like art very much reflects the times of what people believe, architecture also does as well. And so if we can trace the philosophical influences behind architecture, it can just show a lot of why we build the way that we build. And so with this, I noticed there was a big shift that happened with modernism. And in modernism, there was a big change in the way that we viewed art and architecture and what was important. And modernism framed around this idea that function was more important than beauty, and that it was these two separate entities, and that as modern man, we shouldn't need the lesser of beauty anymore. We actually just needed function. And so modernism sought to create this new design form language that was just prioritizing function without anything else. And so this is what the fragmented design means. It's this idea of kind of picking apart what used to be a holistic view of design where beauty and function were both important. It now just over prioritizes one and actually splits them apart. And so the four main key tenets of modernism can be summarized in this way. First, um, to create a simple aesthetic, it's the idea that technological progress requires the elimination of ornamental features in favor of a geometric reduction. The second is machine, the notion that architecture should reflect the specific technological movement in history. And so since we were in a modern age of industrialism, that our architecture should reflect that and therefore look with a machine aesthetic. The third was superior, the belief that modern civilization has achieved a fundamentally different and superior cultural status, and therefore influence architecture to draw from a limited form language. So, really, just the idea that this new form language is superior to those of past generations. And then the last is that progress, that we need to reject architectural geometries of older eras as inconsistent with modernity, marking them for elimination. And so not only should we come up with this new aesthetic, but we should get rid of the old patterns, old ways of doing everything. And I just have this quote to kind of get this idea in just kind of where I was with my research. I just really thought, like, are these actually foundational theories that we should even embrace, that just because they were what was embraced at the time doesn't necessarily mean it was good for design. And so this quote just says, modernistic design condemns use of ornament, pattern, or precedent as reactionary, uncreative, and lacking in imagination. But in an age that demands new thinking, perhaps it is the attitude itself that betrays the ultimate lack of imagination. And I have these four symbols over here correlating with each tenet of the four, because through my research, I discovered that when you actually look at what science and technology is teaching us, it's actually opposite to what modernism thought. And so, just kind of setting the stage for a lot of my research to come, just to open our minds to possibly new thinking and just reworking these things that we've embraced without even realizing. So then, if to kind of trace the philosophy, we now can kind of trace what actually impacted design and the changes that occurred. And so, what does this mean for design now? And a lot of it I've kind of mentioned before, but I just started breaking it apart a little bit here, where you can see that before, architecture was very ordered and detailed. It prioritized balance, it had cultural expression, it was highly ornamented, it was beautiful. Beauty was even um, a main priority within architecture. It was very layered and complex. And then you can just contrast that to um, a lot of what we see now in architecture, and it's very industrial. It follows a single aesthetic. It's abstract, simplified, very square. It's made of standardized materials, and it's highly unornamented. So what does this actually mean for the users who use it? And through my research, I found that there's actually a lot of negative impacts that come from embracing this type of design. And to kind of sum it up, there's like four main categories. The first is aesthetic degradation, which really just at its core means that it creates buildings that aren't beautiful, and that what used to be before a very highly important aesthetic now has just become kind of arbitrary and unimportant. And through that, we actually just lose the beauty that past cultures had. The second is the loss of culture. And so by dismissing traditional cultures and value, we lose a lot of that heritage. And even now, with a lot of the buildings we build, it's completely the same. Like no matter where you go geographically, it doesn't actually accurately portray the culture living there. It's very much standardized and the same. And so we just lose a lot of that cultural differences and expression. The third is dehumanization. And when we treat buildings as commodities and utilize them for corporate branding, which this was done through just the industrial aesthetic in general, they just realized this was, if we could build buildings that were made completely of industrial material, it would be good for business, and business was boom because they would need all these materials. And so even at the root, the idea of using it for corporate branding, rather than designing with the user's well-being at the center, it creates spaces that are actually harmful and damaging on humans' emotion, mental, and physical well-being. And then the fourth is non-resilience. And so building to fit a mold rather than considering and designing in a way that highlights the complex interplay of all facets of design, which is context, nature, culture, experience, beauty, materiality. All of this creates buildings that are out of place within the framework of the city as a whole, and therefore not able to adapt to the changes of changing times. They are not timeless, and they do not last as long. So they go out of date and out of style very quickly. And interestingly enough, the results are also unsustainable, and there's economic loss. So there's even negative impacts felt on the city as a whole and environments as a whole. And these negative impacts can be traced kind of across the different scales in design. So whether it's the full facade of the building, down to the interiors, all the way down to the individual details. And so what do these everyday effects look like on buildings? And so kind of to break it down from just loose principles to more specific things, you can see I just listed some examples of how it affects, and I even have these kind of just visual examples of what you might see in design where it used to be highly ornamented, how we've just simplified it and created this streamlined aesthetic. And so with the loss of cultural heritage, you can see just even thinking of our own examples in life of everyday places we experience, there's just lack of uniqueness, creativity, and variety. It's like I said, unable to differentiate from city to city or society to society. And so we just lose a lot of the history there too. And with the aesthetic degradation, there's a lack of beauty. We make lower value designs. They're just unremarkable. There's no meaning behind it. And really, they're unenjoyable for the users. And with the dehumanization, um, it's unable to connect with the users who occupy it. It's has actual limited functionality, which is kind of ironic considering functionality is supposed to be the top priority. They're unstimulating to the brain, which is I'll get into in a minute, and they're unwelcoming to people. And then with non-resilience, they utilize short-lived materials, they date quickly, they're non-adaptable, and they're actually higher cost in the long term. And so then I just have another quote here that I thought really kind of summed up this idea. It says, "Put usefulness first and you will lose it. Put beauty first, and what you get will be used forever." It turns out that nothing is more useful than the useless. And this is just kind of the idea that what modernism noted as useless, which is beauty, they thought it was arbitrary and unnecessary. If you try to get rid of it, you actually end up creating something that doesn't have as much value as if you had put it first. And it's kind of interesting how this just plays out. We can just see it in examples in the way that we build. And so getting into the research, um, I first kind of looked at what do people actually prefer? Because if we're creating buildings that are user-centric, it should really revolve around what the user finds as attractive and what they enjoy. And so through a lot of different surveys, I kind of summed it up to just this little overview. And so 80% of people prefer a traditional classical look over all contemporary styles. And so this isn't just modern design, but this is actually just um, designs in general, like brutalist architecture, kind of just your everyday office buildings, like anything. The traditional classical look is preferred over those. And this preference extends across age groups, genders, races, income, and education levels. So it's not just based on certain types of people, it's actually 80% of all these different demographics. Interestingly, too, there's a big correlation between the people who prefer them are a lot more likely to be architects than just city planners and everyday regular people. And so some of this too just shows a slight education bias. Those that who have gone to school and are taught to enjoy this type of architecture are more likely to enjoy it and prefer it than just your everyday people experiencing it. And then over here, this is kind of showing the ranking of what was the top to the least. And so neoclassical is the most preferred, while brutalist is the least preferred across all the different types of architecture. And then looking at materiality, classical materials such as stone and brick are preferred much more over steel, concrete, and glass. And then lastly, classical design correlates with positive user well-being. And this is just true from all the studies. They just found that this was consistent. And so this just kind of starts getting into the question of, is it just a user preference? Is beauty just this kind of arbitrary thing? Like, how do you even measure it? And really, there starts to be this correlation where it actually statistically just shows that there is something more at play than just people's preferences. And this gets into some of the biological responses of humans experiencing environments. And newer research has begun to connect that the brain actually has different responses viewing classical architecture and more modern forms. And the way that your brain perceives is actually what makes you enjoy a space or not enjoy, and is also connected to either the positive effects or the negative effects. And so just to give a little overview, this diagram kind of shows just what happens when in your brain when you first walk into a space. And so the measuring shows 5 to 10 milliseconds all the way to 100 and 150 milliseconds. And during that first little window when you walk in a space, that's when your brain quickly scans your surroundings and analyzes them so that it can make a judgment about it and understand it. And so detection is the first little window from 5 to 40 milliseconds. And this is where your brain actually really makes a judgment about the space. And whatever it judges during this time doesn't change afterwards. So even if you're exposed to it longer, your initial preference stays the same. And during the detection phase, it quickly scans the surroundings at a rapid speed, and so it needs to pick up on these certain detail elements so that it can understand the space quickly. And so below you can see with these kind of heat map photos, it's showing kind of a simulation that was done using now newer AI technology to simulate what happens in your brain. And so on the left, here's a famous modern building, and when the brain scans it, you can see that there's actually nothing um, connecting where the modern building is, and that just shows that your brain actually doesn't perceive it in that first detection phase at all. It just sees it as perceptually meaningless. The second is a more industrial, like everyday office building, and you can see where it starts to pick up in certain areas, but this is actually still not a positive correlation, because when the brain scans and it sees something that's too repetitive, it's actually still going to be repulsed by that. And so then third, there's a more classically designed building, and you can see that the way that the brain scans it, it has this kind of smooth flow look to it. It's not super repetitive with a lot of hot spots. It's just gradual. And this is due to something called geometric fractals that when they're when they're present in a space, your brain is able to scan it quickly and understand it. And when your brain can understand it, that sends good signals. And so that means that your brain likes it. And you think, oh, I like this space, but really it's your brain being able to perceptually understand it, and it feels safe and it feels welcomed. And on the flip side, if it has these negative connections, it's actually telling you that you don't enjoy the space and you feel unsafe there. And so you're repulsed by it. So to kind of continue in that, this pattern also continues on to like the detail level. So that was looking at facades that are from the full view, but if you zoom in, there should be a continuation of the same effect to have just positive outcomes. So when you look at this building on the left, zoomed in all the way, you can see that this negative pattern continues. It becomes even more exemplified. The second, that was a modern building. Again, it's still perceptually meaningless up close. But here is a classical column, and you can see zoomed in, this pattern continues. And so this continues with the geometric fractal idea. And geometric fractals really are just these shapes that are satisfying to your brain, and they're prevalent in nature within the golden ratio, if you've heard about that before. And so they continue on scales. If you start with bigger ones and then get smaller and smaller and smaller, that is positive to your brain. And so you enjoy seeing those kinds of shapes. And what kind of designs does this look like on an everyday scale? Well, I kind of drew just some simple examples of what it might look like on an everyday space. And they show both the ones that are understimulating, overstimulating on the left over here, just with the different materiality. And then on the right, you can see where there's been some classical ornament added. This is the kind of thing that allows you to be able to perceive more than just a blank wall. You can actually understand it and you enjoy it. And so being in spaces that are either good or bad over a long period of time can have either good or bad impacts as well. Being in a space that is constantly telling your brain that this is harmful and unsafe can lead to these negative impacts that are like alienation, visual overload, disconnect from nature, isolation, stress and cognitive load, emotional dissonance, and loss of meaning. And then on the flip side, if you have um, positively designed environments, it has a endless amount of positive impacts as well. And so the one that I found was most interesting is the salutogenic effect that it can actually be healing to you versus damaging. And a lot of this has been linked to early childhood development and how being in a good space can also just help with brain development, even in children. And so, kind of getting into the classical design aspect, I started just wondering why is classical design a good example of this and how is it achieved? And so, I really started doing just a case study on what makes up classical design and how can we even design like that and the details that go into it. And what's interesting is even though all of this research on neurological patterns hadn't been done until recently, classical design is actually a good example of what positive designing looks like. And I really think this is because they designed in a way that was just based on their own perception and how they analyzed spaces. They designed what felt good to them and looked good to them, and our biological um, impulses are actually what helps us know what's good and bad design because it's what our brain enjoys and doesn't. And so, what's interesting is if you look into all the way to the detailed layer of classical architecture, it's built with mathematical proportions highly involved. And so, when you follow it, it creates these geometric fractals that allow humans to analyze and connect with a space. And so I started researching the ornament specifically, as that was the main thing that was cut out during modernism and is one of the main aspects I'm hoping to add in my project and understand how we can create positive ornament because it's actually really important to the users. And so there's these two kind of parts that make up these ornamental features. The first is the geometry, the different curves and shapes that go into it. And then there's also the artistic detail that really shows a lot of the cultural expression. And by mixing and matching these together, that's how the different orders of classical architecture were created. And even newer styles can be adapted just by changing things out, using them differently. And on the left here, this is a diagram kind of showing the repetitiveness of the different features in ornament that when you look at it, your brain is able to pick it up and see that where it gets bigger and smaller. And this is tracing some different aspects of it. There's the difference in between. You can see where it's measuring the ends and beginnings of the different spaces, and then also just the repetitive balance of the elements themselves. So repeating the same shape over and over again can be a positive thing to do. And then another aspect of classical architecture that I researched was regionalism. And this is the idea that you create buildings based on what is local to that area. And obviously, this was done in ancient times just because there was no other option. There weren't imported materials, at least not for a very expensive cost. And so spaces automatically had great cultural expression because they were being designed independently by the people who just live there and they would develop over time. And so this is a key aspect that's also just missing nowadays. And it's also one of the key reasons why classical architecture was so resilient and good for the environment and economy. And so regionalism is using local and um, natural materials. It also uses passive cooling and heating techniques, and it has longevity and adaptability. And so these buildings actually last so much longer than buildings do now. On average, buildings that we build nowadays are expected to last about 60 years, versus we know that when you visit ancient cities, there's even medieval architecture that's still standing, and it's a lot to do with just the materials and the way that they built. And the positive impacts of designing with regionalism is it's a low environmental impact. It's resilient, so it lasts over time. It has cultural expression, and it creates timeless designs. And so this kind of moves into where my project is currently going. And so by using my research that I've done, I'm working to incorporate it into a design solution. And so this holistic design is the idea that we need both function and beauty, and so this is kind of just a diagram showing that of how you use the beauty aspect and the function together to create the ultimate design solution. So we shouldn't create beautiful things that are useless, of course, like it needs to have both. And so some of the things that I've been using to achieve this is both understanding form language and pattern language. And these terms were kind of keyed by Christopher Alexander in his book, A Pattern Language. And really, a pattern language is what he calls the different ways that we build, and it's the functional aspects of buildings. And so over time, we know just by doing what is good design and what isn't, like what works and what doesn't. And so his book, A Pattern Language, goes a lot into just throughout history what we've learned makes good design and how we can solve different design problems through utilizing these different patterns, which are really just adaptable solutions in design. So that is very much the functional aspect. And then the second is the form language, which pertains to the visual and stylistic elements. And so form language changes a lot depending on your different expression, like the different cultural expressions and the different materials that may be used. It's a lot of the creativity. It's the parts that adapt and change building to building. But there can be good form languages or there can be bad form languages. And an example of that would be the idea of the modernist design, how it is a form language. It has these rules that you follow to create the aesthetic, but it's not necessarily good for the users who are actually using it. And so my goal in this project is to learn from the classical form language to understand what makes a good form language, and then further from there to understand how we can begin using just modern styles and things that we enjoy and are inspired by to create and evolve new form languages that will actually be positive rather than destructive. So that sums up my project for today with a lot of the research I've been doing. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Bekah. That was really, really interesting. All right.
Thanks.
So next up, we have Carissa.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Let me share my screen. All right, and then I will jump right into it. My name is Carissa Oskam, and this is my quick presentation on religious expression through architecture. So, why do we need religious architecture? From my research, I have found that roughly 84% of the population identifies with at least some sort of a religious group. That's roughly 5 out of every 6 people, so that's quite a few people. Therefore, having a proper space to practice their religion is essential. This can include having a space within one's home or having a community space where they can gather with others who have similar or the same beliefs as them. Now, religious architecture gives meaning, stability, and a place for purpose while providing a safe gathering space. My research examines the human experience of faith practices and the architectural or design elements that aid and support in providing functionality within these religious spaces. People need to externally express themselves, and is it important to do that in community with others who share the same beliefs? There are architectural elements that are needed to support the human expression of faith practices which come from these religious beliefs. Now, to summarize my project and research objectives, I strive to simply help others gain a basic understanding of different religions and the importance of having a proper worship space, along with identifying the important architectural elements. I find religion to be a fascinating topic, and researching religion from an architectural or design standpoint really just combined these two topics together, and I found it very fun. Now, before I start, I would like to say that there are an infinite number of religious groups in the world, and while I do understand that, even within these religious groups, there are varying segments. The information presented here today are the basic concepts of beliefs and practices compiled based on my literature review, field studies, precedent studies, and interviews. So for this project, I decided to focus on the 5 most prevalent religions today: Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, and Buddhism. I researched their beliefs to gain a basic understanding going forward in my project, which can be found in my research booklet. Today, I will be discussing one common practice within each of these religious groups and the architectural elements that support these practices. I use the term practice as not all religions worship a higher power, but in their own way show honor and acknowledgement towards a higher power. So today, rather than talking about my specific research process, I'll just be jumping right into my findings. So starting off with Judaism, Judaism believes in an omnipotent God, and they read from the Torah, their holy book. The Torah teaches Jewish law, history, beliefs, and their practices. They believe in living life according to what God teaches. One of their popular Jewish practices is Saturday Shabbat. My research is based on reading and attending the local synagogue right here in Kalamazoo, the Congregation of Moses. During a Shabbat service, one can expect 6 basic things. The first is before the service even starts, when putting on the traditional kippah or tallit. Tallit is prayer shawl. This is only for Jews and involves saying a quick prayer and preparing their hearts and mind for the service. During the prayer, one can expect standing and sitting prayer where the congregation speaks in traditional Hebrew as they pray from the Siddur. Siddur is their prayer book. This book gives direction for what to say and when to sit or stand. The favorite part of the service is the Torah reading. Before starting, there is a processional, which involves opening of the Ark, which is where the Torah is kept. After it is taken out, the Torah is then paraded around the room while members of the congregation say a quick prayer and place their tzitzits, or the fringes of their prayer shawl, to the Torah. The Torah is then read aloud to the congregation by designated members, and after reading the Torah, it is then paraded back around the room again before being placed into the Ark for safekeeping. To end Shabbat, a specific closing prayer is said from the Siddur, or prayer book. Now, a Jewish synagogue is very simple and only technically needs 2 items for Shabbat: an ark and a bima. The ark is where the Torah is kept and is always placed on the wall facing Israel. This is because during prayer, they always face the holy city, and the ark in Israel is considered the holy city based from the Torah. The other is the bima, which is where the Torah is placed during readings. Bima literally means a platform that goes up. It is usually placed in the middle of the room with the congregation surrounding it. Another option item to have in a synagogue is the ever-burning light that symbolizes God's presence will never go out. The flame is always lit, with modern ones being electrical rather than a literal flame, but many synagogues do still have a flame. Next, we have Islam or Muslim. Islam started with the Prophet Muhammad, who received sacred revelations from God through an angel. The Muslims' holy book is the Quran and is the holy words of the Prophet Muhammad. They believe in a singular, omnipotent God. There are 5 pillars of Islam, which are essentially their Muslim practices. One pillar is the 5 daily prayers, or salat. This involves praying 5 times a day at very specific times. These prayers involve cleansing oneself to be spiritually clean before even starting the prayer. During the prayer, one must face Mecca as it is the holy city, similar to how Jews face Israel. The prayer involves a set of steps from standing prayer, ruku, and sitting prayer. These involve specific sets of motions and sayings to be said throughout the prayer. Now, once completed with steps 1 through 6, as shown on this slide, that is considered one raka. Different salahs or prayer times require different amount of rakas, so these steps will just be repeated as necessary per the prayer. An Islamic mosque is where one can go to pray. While it's not necessary to attend the local mosque 5 times a day for every prayer, men are expected to go on Fridays during the midday prayer at their local mosque. The orientation of a mosque is very important, as prayer is said facing Mecca. There's typically a niche or a little cutout in the wall that is facing Mecca to point people in the right direction. So you're never trying to figure out which direction Mecca is. Mosques are also very symmetrical and have balance, repetition, and symmetry throughout the entire space. This involves having 2 symmetrical prayer halls, one for women and one for men, as they are not allowed to pray together. This also involves having 2 ablution or cleansing areas. Wudu involves cleansing one's hands, face, and feet, while ghusl isn't cleansing the entire body. The entire cleansing of the body isn't typically performed in a mosque. Typically, they only have areas for wudu. Minarets are also found on the outside of mosques and are the kind of the large towers shown outside that are used for gatherings of prayer. It's an international symbol for a mosque, while also is used for large prayer and utilizing one's voice to project during a large prayer ceremony together. Throughout my further dive into research of designing a mosque, I found a lot more architectural elements that I had initially missed in my research that I'm presenting here, and I'm really excited to share it in my final project. Now going into Hinduism. Hinduism is different from Judaism and Islam, as they believe in a Brahma, the ultimate deity who can take many forms, like gods and goddesses. The Hindu holy book is the Veda, which serves as a compass for spiritual and ethical guidance. One interesting fact is that the origins of Hinduism are actually unknown, but many Hindus don't really care that it's unknown, though some do wish that they knew. One of their spiritual practices is puja. Puja is worship, and with the use of an idol or icon. This involves taking an icon in which a deity will inhabit during the worship service. To start, Hindus will light a lamp and then ring a bell to inform the deity of their arrival and to cleanse the space of evil spirits. Now, in my research, I found that there are a ton of steps to puja, more than I could provide in a single presentation or slide, so I kind of broke it down into some of the larger steps. The next steps right after ringing the bell are 2 mantras. These 2 mantras are for purifying the deity's seat and denoting a worshiper's favorite deity. After a few more steps comes purification, which involves sprinkling purified water from a kalasa pot over the idol to sanctify the god, representing the 5 elements. The final step of puja is to thank the gods and prepare them for their departure by offering gifts to express love and devotion. While Hindu puja often happens within one's own home, Hindu temples are beautiful architectural spaces where one can also perform worship. Hindu temples are designed based off of ancient texts and are a very spiritual process. Sculptures are found all around Hindu temples showing depictions of the gods and goddesses in their prime moments. These icons are not idols, but rather are meant to be inhabited by God himself or the Brahmin. Within the temple, it is broken up into 3 sections, with the Garbhagriha being the innermost chamber where the deity meant for worship is placed. There's typically only one of them within the Hindu temple. Only Brahmin, or the holy teachers, are actually allowed in this space. Instead, there's a path surrounding it for worshipers to walk during prayers towards the deity. It's a very ritualistic process. Now, Hindu temples are not only adorned with sculptures, but also have many other objects relating to spiritual and artistic traditions of Hinduism. These symbolic elements can be seen through intricate designs, colors, or many other cosmic elements. Jumping right into Christianity, Christians believe in a perfect and loving God. They believe that God has sent his son, Jesus Christ, to earth where he died on a cross to save his people from sin. The Bible is a holy book and contains the history, laws, and stories of Jesus Christ. Christians believe in living life according to what God teaches. A typical practice for Christians is attending their local church service. During a Christian church service, one can expect 5 basic things. Before starting, it is common for members of the congregation to meet with each other as community is such an important factor of faith. During the service, one of the first items is singing and praising. This is one of the most popular forms of worship amongst Christians, and it is often mentioned in the Bible as an outward performance of thanksgiving towards God. Part of every service is the Bible reading. Typically, the pastor, priest, or other chief church leader will select a few verses and read them aloud before presenting a sermon on those selected verses. Preaching is a short, biblically based talk to provide insight, guidance, and gain knowledge on how to live life according to what God teaches. The sermon is the longest part of the service, and to end, there is prayer. Prayer is considered a fundamental practice of Christianity, which is why it is often in the beginning and end of the service. Prayer can take a variety of forms and include giving thanks to God, asking for help and healing, or simply just having a conversation. There are many types of Christian churches depending on the denomination, from cathedrals, a parish, chapel, and more. These are the universal architectural elements found within all of these church types. The cross is the universal symbol throughout Christianity, and it represents Jesus Christ's death to save his people. The symbol can be found on the interior and exterior, with some churches even being built in the shape of a cross. The orientation can be important or significant, as some churches are built facing the holy city of Israel, similar to Judaism and Islam, but not all are built that way. Another is the podium or a platform, which is similar to the bema, and which is where the pastor will stand during the sermon. The podium is often where the pastor will just place the Bible while they read. As praise is such an influential practice, many churches do have some sort of choir, instruments, or band, depending on how they choose to worship. This can take the form of choir stands or instruments for a praise team to play while leading worship. Lastly is a baptismal font or pool. Baptism is the ceremonial sign of membership into the Christian faith and is a symbol of being cleansed from one's sin and reborn into the faith. Now, Buddhism. Buddhism is the most unique religion out of these 5, as it is not actually considered a belief system, but rather a way of life. They are the only religion that does not worship a deity, but rather holds the Buddha as an honored teacher. Buddhism started with Siddhartha Gautama, who was the first to attain enlightenment and become the Buddha. The path to enlightenment is a fundamental pillar in Buddhist practice and is the overall end goal. I attended a Buddhist morning chant at a monastery in Battle Creek, which is how I gained a lot of my information along with my literature review. Now, before entering the temple or monastery, shoes must be removed as dirt should not be brought into such a sacred space. When entering any room or talking with anyone, it is important to bow to show reverence and respect. This involves simply placing the hands together and slightly tilting the head down. Even I was bowed to when I entered the spaces. Now, when gathering for a community chant, it is important to stay silent and be respectful to those around you who may be meditating before the chant. Buddhism is all about awareness of the mind, body, soul, and surrounding environment. Right before the chant starts, one of the monks will come forward and bow to the Buddha before lighting incense in preparation before taking their seat. Throughout the entirety of the chant, the leading monk will bang on traditional drums while supplying the appropriate sayings for the chant. These chants are accompanied by a series of specific movements, some facing the Buddha, bowing to the Buddha, either standing up or hands on knees, hands on their hands and knees. There's a lot of repetition. Once the chant is finished, it ends with facing the wall to have minimal distraction while meditating. When meditating, it's very important to sit with the legs crossed, back straight, eyes, head and eyes forward, with hands placed gently in one's lap. Now, Buddhist temples are often designed quite differently between one to the next, but there are three key architectural elements that can be found in all Buddhist temples. The first are the traditional drums to lead the group or community in their chants and meditations. This image to the left shows the traditional drums from the monastery that I had visited. These provide rhythm and direction during the chants. The second are Buddhist mats or cushions, as all meditation takes place on the floor. It helps to cushion the often hard ground while meditating for hours. No one wants to sit on a hardwood surface for such a long time. And the last is some sort of Buddha statue. These statues are often golden and are provided as an icon or direction for meditation, as it's important to remember that Buddhists do not worship the Buddha, but rather regard him in great respect. So these statues are not meant for worship, but rather as a direction for meditation to show honor during their practice. So what's next? Throughout the semester, though it is almost over and my final project is due in about 3 weeks, I have been designing each religion in its own space, focusing on the orientation on architectural elements needed for these 5 religious practices. I am redesigning our very own Western Michigan Canley Chapel 4 different times to highlight the importance of having a unique space for all of these religions, along with highlighting the significant architectural elements. I've had many people ask me why I'm not, designing one space that can fit all religions, but based on my research and what I just presented, I find it important that these architectural elements and religions have their own significant space. Now, if you enjoyed my research and are interested in my final project, you'll just have to wait for the senior showcase or final presentation. Thanks, guys.
Nice little plug there for the senior showcase. Thank you, Carissa and Bekah. I might go ahead and open up the floor for any questions. Feel free to just unmute and ask or type questions in the chat. I already see we have one comment that says that's very interesting. It is. I really enjoy the process of seeing the research evolved and matured from, some of the last times we've talked. All right. Okay, question in the chat. Bekah, do you think that one of the everyday effects that you mentioned has more of an impact on a space than others? Loss of cultural heritage, dehumanization, aesthetic degradation, and non-resilience.
I think the one that hits me the most is the dehumanization, I would say, probably just because it's the one we all kind of relate to and feel it without even really knowing. I don't know, some spaces you go in and you really hate it and you might not even know why, but you really it just repulses you. And so I think it's also kind of the most important one since it's really about the well-being of people who are using it. And so that's probably the one that really kind of started and was the most obvious from the beginning. So I think probably that.
We'll see. So both of your presentations are quite different, but they have some similarities. I'm curious, Carissa, through your research on how the human spirit is expressed architecturally, has anything that Bekah has found in her research become important as you look to design an expressive space?
Yeah, so a lot of my project is a lot of just, I have those specific architectural elements that I pointed out in my presentation, but a lot of it is just symmetry and having all of these little detailed elements. I've done a lot of research the second semester on some of like the materiality. A lot of it is like custom built work and intricate designs and just creating a beautiful space that when you walk into it, you can just almost feel, as Dustin's words, feel the holiness. Um, so yeah, I definitely think I think it would be beneficial, honestly, to talk to Bekah about some of these elements because, yeah, it is really about not only have the functional architectural elements, but creating a space that truly feels, um, yeah, holy, I guess.
We have a question in the chat. What religion are you finding the hardest to architecturally accommodate?
That's a good one. So one that I actually have chosen to completely not design is Hinduism, because through my research, I found that they are designed based on ancient texts, literally giving like directions on how to design it for specific gods. And out of respect, I didn't want to design a space and design it inappropriately. And also, um, in the images, I know I showed just small images, but they are really adorned with sculptures and icons all over. Like that is the entire exterior. There is no flat surface. So I really didn't want to depict that in the wrong way and chose to just not design that out of respect of not wanting to show it in the wrong light, but also honoring that it is really interesting. And I loved researching Hinduism because it is probably the most different out of the five.
Hmm. Another question for both. What made you choose these topics?
I guess I'll go first. Sorry, Chris. Um, I have always been really inspired by classical architecture, and I also I just feel like I'm in awe of it when I see it in person, and I just always wondered how they even designed something like that or made it. And so it really just started like out of curiosity. I just wanted to kind of learn about that and all that goes into designing classical architecture. And also just kind of like I said, like the fact that I could just stand there and like gaze at the buildings all day. And then it's like here, there's hardly anything I know nearby that I would like go out of my way to go just look at. And so just even the value I wondered behind that of like why don't we design things that are awe-inspiring um and timeless like that like what could our city even look like if we implemented that kind of approach instead? So kind of just, yeah, I guess kind of like a personal reason. And it's been really fun to learn about. I recommend to anybody else who's into that kind of thing.
I guess I can go now. Thanks, Becca. Um, so yeah, Becca said it was for like a really personal reason, and I definitely recommend um when you get to capstone, choose a project that is kind of personal towards you, just so that I mean, we're studying these topics for an entire year. You don't want to get bored of it. But when I first got introduced to Capstone, I am a Christian. So I came up to Kim and I said, Kim, I want to design a church. That's all I want to do. I want to design a church. And in my further research, I kind of found a fascination with learning about other religions, and diving deep into combining that my love of learning about other religions into the design aspect that we are always researching and designing every day. And I found it, I almost used it as like, here's some school time that I can use to research other religions and actually get to explore these spaces. So it was just a lot of fun, really, for myself and almost an excuse to use school time to research other religions. But I definitely enjoyed it, and I'm so glad that I decided not to just design a church.
All right. For Bekah, Do you have an idea of the type of space you want to implement that type of construction, whether it's commercial or residential?
Yeah, so I actually already have a building that I've been working on, because I decided to just take it kind of the approach of redesigning or like adjusting the design of a building to talk about how like you can make small changes to kind of implement this. And so I picked a little apartment building downtown Kalamazoo, and the reason I picked it is really just because it's kind of like an everyday, nothing like special but nothing horrible kind of space. Like it's just kind of exactly like what I'm talking about. Just like it does the functional requirements, but nothing more than that. And so I really wanted to pick a space that is a part of somebody's everyday life, as I was like talking about all these impacts that it has. Obviously, somewhere that you only visit like once every month or something won't have as much of an impact on you as like the place you're actually living or doing everyday life in. And I just thought an apartment would be an interesting idea too, just because I feel like a lot of times they're very modern and kind of the opposite. And so just like rethinking it um, with this approach instead. So that's what I'm doing.
Neat. All right, question for both. What difficulties did you face when beginning to find research for your topic?
I can go, Becca, since you started last time. Um, so I think for my topic, it might be different than a lot of others. I actually struggled with paring down my information because religion is such a broad topic. I actually struggled with trying to figure out what to focus on and what to focus my research. I mean, I was surrounded by 12 books on 18 different things, and so it was quite difficult to actually pare down what I wanted to focus on and finding the appropriate resources for that. So Kim and Dustin were very helpful in helping to actually pare down and focus on a specific topic, which led me to like my disclaimer, there's millions and millions of religions out there, but trying to focus on what I was most interested in and the functionality of these spaces. And then it was more easy to do research with having very specific information that I was looking for.
I feel like for me, it's kind of similar too about like trying to pare it down. And really, at first, like, I think since my project kind of just started out of a like, well, I'm viewing this and this is kind of from my own perspective, what I've noticed. Let me like do a research project on it. It was kind of hard to even like know if there was any research on this kind of thing out there. And for like a long time, I couldn't really find anything. And so it was really like it was just difficult to even know how to like begin researching it. And um I I actually went a lot in order that I even presented it. Like I started really with the philosophy, and I found that all so interesting, but then I would research about science and then kind of about art and style, and that there were just so many moving pieces. I was like, how do I even bring this together into like one project? And so really when I started finding like the scientific studies that like began kind of connecting everything. And so sometimes I think like even for you guys when you're working on it in the future, like don't be discouraged if it feels slow going, that you're kind of like every day you're like researching and things, but you don't feel like you're making a lot of progress because it really is a whole year that you're like looking at this info. And so it'll come together in time. Yeah.
We do have another question for you, Becca. Is it more expensive and does it take longer, or does it take a longer duration of time to design in that way? Is that why it is not seen as often?
Yeah, so these are pretty much the reasons why, or like the, I guess, excuses at least people use to kind of explain why. It can definitely be more expensive if you're using better quality materials, sometimes even more materials if you're doing um, artistic details versus like I mean, if it's just flat and blank, of course, it's like less material. And it does just take more time, even just in the planning stage, I think, like the intentionality that has to go into it, like even trying to design just one ornamental feature, like takes a really long time if you think about it, like all the detail that goes into it. Um, but I think a lot of the reason too is really just our design methods nowadays are so different, where in the past, a lot of designing happened like while the building was being built and by craftsmen making it, there was like just a level of detail that people naturally did. And so like if you had a woodworker building a door frame for your house, like they would add their own artistic detail automatically. It wasn't like something you had to spec and order like we do today. And so I think the industrialization also just has a big impact on it. And it's a lot easier to just make a standard rectangle materials that can be used in all the different applications versus like having to take the time to really like craft something. And I think a lot of it too is just because since we like even if we don't realize we act like the whole function and beauty thing is true, that function really is more important than beauty. And so um it's always just pretty much about the bottom line in design. It's just about what can be done cheaply and quickly. And so beauty is just given the back seat. It's like if you have to pick one or the other, everybody's picking function. And so then um it's kind of like that quote I said, if you just aim for functionality, the beauty will get lost. Like you have to take that extra step to focus on beauty first. So I don't know if that answers it, but
And then it looks like we have one last question here, again for Bekah. Does modernization take away from the characterization and personality in architecture?
I would definitely say yes. I think even like like if you look at just the everyday type of building, like even how I was saying like, oh, I picked this apartment building that isn't really special, isn't really like horrible, like it does the job. I think that's how most buildings tend to be built now. Like everybody can think of the generic like square ceiling panels that you use in every space, and like the blocks, like the CMU blocks that are used to build every building. And like of course there's a lot less just creativity that goes into these everyday type buildings. Not necessarily to say like, oh, just modern aesthetic is bad, but almost like the everyday designs that have come by like embracing this kind of theology and like philosophy of the way that we think design should be and what's important in design. And so I think especially those kind of everyday examples are where it gets lost.
All right, thank you. Well, that concludes today's Design and Discourse. Thank you to Bekah and Carissa. These were fantastic, and thank you to our audience. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and we'll be finished up for today. Thanks, everybody.